Welcome to this special program on Kairali channel. This is a panel conversation between Professor Noam Chomsky of University Professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and two leading experts in the field of the mass media in India, Ram, who is editor of Frontline and also editor of Business Line and Sports Star, and Shashi Kumar, the chairman of the Media Development Foundation, which has established in Chennai the Asian College of Journalism. Noam Chomsky is perhaps the world's most renowned academic scholar. He is the founder of the modern science of linguistics. He is a social theorist, activist, a media critic, and author of many books, philosopher, and a great inspiration to people involved in anti-imperialist activism all over the world. I shall not take too much. I shall not take any further time, in fact, in introducing Professor Chomsky. And the method of this program will be that our two panelists will raise questions to which Professor Chomsky will respond. We will begin with a discussion of the present international situation and crisis in Afghanistan, and go on to discuss other issues and fields with Professor Chomsky. Ram, would you like to begin?
Professor Chomsky, Noam, we are now being told that the evidence has come because it has been widely perceived that the United States and its allies in this new war against terror, that's what it's called, have been unable to produce concrete evidence. But has the situation radically changed with what is reported in the newspapers right now, that the Sunday Telegraph of the UK has obtained a videotape which shows that Osama bin Laden is claiming authorship of the September 11 crimes for himself and Al-Qaeda. Does this make a world of difference in how we should view the situation?
Well, there is, first of all, a small lesson in how to read the newspapers. Disregard the headlines and turn to whatever content there is in the story. I didn't see the videotape, of course, but from the story that has been reported, there's nothing that says we did it, or I did it, or Al-Qaeda did it, or anything of the sort. In fact, the statement that's reported is very familiar. It's what I see every time I turn on BBC and CNN, except that I see it said by Tony Blair or George W. Bush. What they say on television to all of us day after day is there's two kinds of terror. There's the kinds I carry out, which is good terror, and the kind you carry out, which is bad terror. And that's exactly what Osama bin Laden says. He says, two kinds of terror, we do it, it's good terror, you do it, it's bad terror. They are different. Osama bin Laden's not identical to Bush and Blair. He's much more modest. So Osama bin Laden says, we will drive you out of our lands. Blair and Bush also say, we will drive you out of our lands, but they mean different things. Osama bin Laden means Muslim lands. Blair and Bush mean the world or the universe, which is correct. That's their lands. That's the imperial heritage. So they say we will drive evil, namely what we don't like, out of the world. And Osama bin Laden says we will drive evil, what I don't like, out of Muslim lands. But apart from that, you can translate up and back very easily between the two of them. So it's a familiar statement. Another difference, I guess, is that while Bush and Blair are happy to take credit for the terror and violence that they're carrying out, so there's no question about looking for evidence. They're applauding themselves for carrying out the violence. Osama bin Laden basically says nothing. He says, yes, I think it was legitimate, but that's it.
Now, Noam, you've been spending many of your waking hours giving interviews and responding to questions. And I personally find it extremely helpful, the questions you raised and response as an analytical framework. You begin by stating two assumptions about two conditions. Would you like to state that for this discussion?
Well, in the talk that you're referring to, I began by saying that I'm assuming two things. One is that the terrorist acts of September 11th were in fact major crimes, maybe crimes against humanity, as Mary Robinson, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, called them. I think that's reasonable. And the second assumption is that we should be committed to trying to reduce the likelihood of such crimes. Not just that one, but many others. And in fact, the context is that there is an ongoing crime which considerably outweighs even the atrocities of September 11th, and that is the crime being committed against the people of Afghanistan. The people living in Kandahar or in villages, they're innocent people. I mean, they didn't carry out the bombing. Whoever carried out the bombing of September 11th, it wasn't them, the attack of September 11th. But they're the ones who were under attack, under severe attack. We don't know the details because when you kill poor, miserable people, nobody counts. It's just normal behavior. But it's very likely, in fact almost certain, that the number of victims of the U.S.-British attack on Afghanistan far exceeds the September 11th crimes. And as it continues, they'll pale into insignificance in comparison. So when we talk about stopping crimes, we do mean terrorist attacks like September 11th, but which is unusual, in fact, historically unique because of the target. I mean, it's the West does this to other people. Other people don't do it to the West. So that's unique. But the ongoing crimes that are being committed right now, which are far more serious, are in fact historically quite normal. That's simply how Europe conquered the world. Now it continues, so no one pays any attention.
You've also spoken about the irrationality, the injustice of the target of the war, and that it's not the people who committed the crime who must face the punishment.
No, in fact, no one even pretends that the people who live in some village in rural Afghanistan committed the crime or even knew about it. They are being targeted because they're weak. They're traditional targets. They're weak, they're poor, they're miserable, they can't fight back, so therefore you destroy them. I mean, there's a long history here. We don't have to, I mean, maybe the most instructive part of the history is right after the First World War. After the Britain, of course, mostly controlled that area, including India at that time. And after the First World War, Britain was no longer in a position to control this huge region by direct force. It had been weakened by the war. So it turned to air power, which was a kind of a new technology at that time. Decided to use air power to try to control the native populations. An interesting series of events took place. The Royal Air Force office in Cairo asked permission from the War Office in London to use air power to deal with what they called recalcitrant Arabs. Arabs is a very broad category, includes anybody, Kurds, Afghans, anyone you like. It went back to Winston Churchill, who was in charge of the War Office. There were the other British embassies didn't like it. The India office thought it was a bad idea. This was right after Amritsar, and they were worried about the reaction in India if Britain started bombing people, poor people all over. Churchill was quite upset. He was angry. He said, I do not understand this squeamishness about the use of, he said, poison gas against uncivilized tribes. The uncivilized tribes he was talking about were Afghans and Kurds. So I do not understand this squeamishness about the use of poison gas against uncivilized tribes. We should use any weapon whatsoever that will save British lives and maintain our control. And poison gas is a very good one because it will inspire a lively terror among these barbarians and enable us to control them. Poison gas at the time was the most horrendous weapon. It was the counterpart to nuclear weapons today. We don't exactly know what happened afterwards. Part of the reason is that no one in England wants to look. These records were declassified, made public about 20 years ago. As soon as I read them, I started writing about them and giving talks about them. There's been no follow-up. Now we can be quite sure we'll never find out. The reason is that the British government 10 years ago declared what they called an open government policy. So now we're going to open up the government to public inspection because we're so democratic. The first act of the open government policy was to remove from the Public Records Office and presumably destroy all records concerning the British use of poison gas and air power to control the uncivilized tribes. So presumably we'll never find out. However, this continued. Throughout the 1920s and the early 30s, Britain continued to rely extensively on aerial bombing of civilians, which was a new terror weapon at the time, to try to control the uncivilized tribes. In fact, I think it was 1932, there was an international conference which tried to, at that time there were many conferences trying to reduce the threat of war and violence. This one was concerned with constraints to prevent the use of air power against helpless civilians. And Britain succeeded in undermining the treaty, and so it never was passed. Lloyd George, a very eminent and respected British statesman, wrote in his diary, this later came out, he was full of praise for the British government for undermining this treaty, and what he said is, we have to reserve the right to bomb the niggers.
In your MIT speech, to which Ram referred, you make this, it's actually quite took many people's breath away, that your comparison between the action being taken against Afghanistan and what the sort of analogous response of Britain would have been to the IRA bombing.
Yeah. Had they bombed Boston and Belfast.
Yeah, I mean, with an IRA, the IRA bombings, of course, were not the same scale as the World Trade Center, but they're very serious. Yeah. I mean, one of the bombs attempted to kill the whole British cabinet, not that small. Well, how did Britain respond? Let's put aside questions of feasibility, which of course are significant, but one possible response would have been to bomb Boston, where I live, which happens to be the main source of funding for the IRA. This is the exile diaspora community, which raises money and very militant.
Boston policemen.
Yeah, they're much more, like usual, as is usually the case, diasporas tend to be much more militant than the home country. So the Irish community in Boston and other places is full of fire and wants someone else to do some killing. And they provide the financing, so they have to wipe them out. And then, of course, they should have wiped out West Belfast, where the Catholic community, where the IRA is based. Well, that would have been, putting aside feasibility, that would have been criminal idiocy, criminal, really. And of course, it was nothing could be considered. What they did do was sensible.
Yes, when you talk about terrorism, practice and use of terrorism, if I've got you right, you have said that state terrorism, all states are by definition terrorists. It's almost kind of truism, isn't it?
Almost, because a state is a system of organized violence, operating in the interests of whatever domestic power happens to be. And that quite typically leads to violence and repression. I mean, it's not automatic, but it's historically natural. Right. And the greater and more powerful the state, the more violent it usually is.
Following from that is that no state can normally intervene humanely in a situation like this. I think you have given two exceptions to that. It's interesting because one of them belongs to India. Indian intervention in Bangladesh, you think, is a case
Whatever the motive.
Humane intervention or humane consequence.
Humane consequence. We have to be distinct. True. I mean, there are examples of humane consequences.
Not intended.
So say destroying Hitler was a good consequence, but it wasn't the intention. Yeah, or Vietnam invading Cambodia to eliminate Pol Pot, or India invading to stop the terror in East Pakistan. I mean, these were actions that had humane consequences, but they don't count as humanitarian interventions. They were not undertaken out of benevolence. They were undertaken out of power interests, and they happen to have humane consequences.
Yes. And yet you, of late, you are talking about a space for a paternalistic state, a state which can have a role in protecting its people. What space or how much space would you give the state?
Well, I wouldn't give the state any space. People have a capacity to protect themselves, and sometimes they, in our system of governance, the only, I don't think it's the best possible way, but the way that exists is through participation in a quasi-democratic process in which people can organize protection for themselves, like water facilities, or
Social security.
health service, or social security, or education, or self-defense. You know, that insofar as the state represents a mechanism by which people acting for themselves can cooperate as a community to achieve some communal end, that's okay. I don't happen to think that this apparatus is the best way of doing it, but it's the one we have. On the other hand, that does not accord the state any rights whatsoever. The state as an entity has no rights, zero. It's as a representative, insofar as it's a representative of the population, then it has the rights. It represents the interests and choices, democratic choices of the population. That's legitimate. But the state has no rights. And if the state acts on its own, as it
Noam, if I could take you back to the new war against terror, focused on war on Afghanistan. Going back to your analytical framework, question number one, what's happening right now? I think there's a very interesting, you put the emphasis on mass starvation as a method, what you call silent genocide, because the people are rightly concerned about killing of civilians, what the Pentagon calls collateral damage. But this aspect, I think, has got relatively little attention, although aid agencies may be sensitive.
It's gotten relatively little attention by the choice of the propaganda system. The decision of the propaganda system, including BBC, CNN, the New York Times, and so on, is to deflect attention away from the atrocities that are happening to marginal atrocities. That's quite typical. So take, say, the Vietnam War. There was tremendous focus on the My Lai massacre. It was a horrible massacre. A few hundred people were killed by some half-crazed, half-educated GIs and soldiers in the field who didn't know what was happening to them, and they did commit a massacre. That massacre happened to be a marginal, tiny footnote to a mass murder operation called Operation Wheeler Wallawa, which was a mass terror operation, one of many, designed to basically wipe out the rural and demolish the rural population, which was the basis for the resistance to the United States. Now, there is no discussion of the mass murder operation. Actually, there's some. I wrote about it when the data came out, but that's not discussed. What's discussed is this little footnote, which you can blame on some poor soldiers in the field who probably didn't know who was going to shoot at them next. You don't blame the people sitting in the air-conditioned offices targeting B-52 raids on villages and organizing these mass murder operations. And it's the same here. Attention is...
What are the estimates of the number of people at risk, you think?
Well, the estimates mostly come from the United Nations, other World Food Organization, other Food and Agricultural Organization, and others, and many aid agencies, Oxfam, and so on. And they're pretty consistent. Everyone pretty much agrees. And in fact, the press also agrees when it reports it. Prior to the bombing, there was prior to September 11th, the situation was quite serious. There were maybe 5 or 6 million people in Afghanistan who were just on the edge of starvation and were being sustained by international food aid. After September 11th, immediately there was a threat of bombing, and people were terrified, naturally. Many people started fleeing into the countryside. The international organizations removed their international workers, so the only ones they had left were local workers. On September 16th, so 5 days later, the United States essentially ordered Pakistan to terminate food deliveries into Afghanistan. That was the main source of the food coming in. It was interesting that there was no reaction to that in the West. The day after that, happened to be on radio and television all over Europe, which I did for several months. And I asked everywhere I spoke, Germany, England, I asked, is there any reaction to this? And there was no reaction anywhere, because that's normal. It's normal for it, and it's correct that there's no reaction. This is the normal behavior of the West towards its victims. We want to starve them to death, we starve them to death. So it doesn't require any.
I think this is a major issue that needs to be flagged.
And then it continues. It continues. By the estimates, to get to your point, by the end of the month, by the end of September, the estimates were that the number of people subject to, on the verge of starvation and needing immediate aid had risen by 50%. So that's an extra 2.5 million people, just as a result of the threat of bombing. The agencies warned that if there's actual bombing, it's going to become much worse, of course. When the bombing took place, even the limited amount of food that was coming in was terminated. It later picked up to an extent, but nowhere near the former level. Winter's coming. You know, as soon as winter's coming, most of the large parts of the country are impassable. Can't get aid to people. When people flee to the countryside, first, there's 2 points to be made about the fleeing. First of all, the attacks on the cities are basically a form of biological warfare. When you bomb a city and you destroy its electrical supplies and its water supplies and its sewage supplies, that's a polite way of saying biological warfare. You can imagine
contamination.
It's, yes, of course. And the main cities, Kandahar, Herat, and others, probably 3/4 of the population fled. When they flee to the countryside, they're fleeing to the most heavily mined area in the world. There were mine clearing operations. They had to be terminated because of the threat of bombing. So it's worse than it was before. And furthermore, now there are U.S. cluster bombs all over the place, which are much worse than landmines. I mean, these are murderous anti-personnel weapons designed to kill people, not to harm a tank. You know. And they're all over the place, and they're impossible to eliminate. It requires technical knowledge that the Pentagon won't provide in order to remove them. They're all over the world, in Laos and other places. So now people are fleeing into areas which are extremely dangerous. The food agencies, so the World Food Program and the Red Cross and others, have warned that the airdrops are extremely dangerous because they draw people to places which might be very dangerous to go into. Aside from the fact that if you drop food somewhere, it's not going to go to women and children and so on. I mean, men will pick it up and take it to the bazaar and sell
French
it.
television had this program.
Of course, what's going to happen?
Where the Northern Alliance troops comes in, clears the place of the yellow food
and
parcels,
sells them in the bazaar.
and then the others come with donkeys and carry the cardboard out.
What's
as
going to
fuel.
happen? And the World Food Program, particularly in the Red Cross, did say that there are circumstances under which airdrops are legitimate, but what you have to do is clear an area, have local people there, your own people there, inform the population that this is a safe area, and drop food in places where there's an organization, and you can give it to the people who need it. To people who are sick, or women, or children, and so on. Well, this is just a propaganda operation. It's received scathing condemnations from the aid agencies. But this whole process is killing an enormous number of people. Yeah. Now, the details we don't know because nobody looks. But as compared with, what's being looked at is what you said, the so-called collateral damage. So occasionally a bomb hits the wrong target, and then everyone goes and says, isn't it terrible, we hit the wrong target. Well, a bomb will hit the wrong target, so that's an accident.
Part of the game.
Part of the game. Yeah. But this is purposeful murderous slaughter of probably millions of people.
It's misleading to look at collateral damage.
Yeah, it's totally misleading.
Or give it too much weight.
It's a marginal consequence. It's like My Lai as compared with the mass murder operation.
But there are two issues here which have appeared in Noam's work. One is to give too much prominence to one incident, and not see the entire context. There's yet another, a methodological point, which he always makes, is that when you assess the deaths caused by an attack, you don't assess the number of people who died in that incident. No? Because if 5 people die when you destroy a pharmaceutical factory, and that pharmaceutical factory is producing life-saving drugs for millions of people, then those millions must count as part of the victims of that bomb.
It's like starvation,
Exactly.
related.
Exactly. So it's, and I think this has, of course, appeared in your recent controversy with Christopher Hitchens,
yes.
that you don't just measure the number of people who die then, but or look at Iraq.
Direct
It's not just the people who died in '91, but the many millions who died since then.
And that's all over the world. I mean, take, say, Laos, one of the poorest countries in the world. In the late 1960s, there was what was called a secret bombing of northern Laos. It was secret because the media knew all about it and refused to print it. And I can tell you that from personal experience, from meetings with the editorial board of the New York Times and Time Life and so on. The information was there, they would not print it. I happened to be there shortly after and interviewed refugees and so on. This was bombing in northern Laos, had nothing to do with the Indochina wars. The government admitted that. It's a poor peasant area with, which at that time was became the most heavily bombed area in the world. Now, right now, by now there are millions, literally millions of unexploded, what are called bomblets, the little pieces of cluster bombs that don't explode. There's about a 20-30% failure rate, presumably in order to kill more people.
Yeah.
Now, if a child picks up one of these little things, flechettes come out and murder him. If a farmer hits one with a hoe, same thing. There are literally millions of them. Now, the number of people dying in northern Laos is not really known, but the aid workers, church volunteer demining groups, I mean, they estimate thousands killed a year. In fact, the Asian Wall Street Journal, their Asia correspondent, Barry Wayne, he accepted the figure of 10,000 deaths a year as possible. He didn't say it's true, he said it could be possible. Well, that's going on right now. This is more than 30 years after the war's over. There's a British demining team, a volunteer demining team trying to deal with it. The Pentagon, to this day, will not give them technical information about how to defuse the unexploded bomblets. Well, these are all casualties of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War may be over, but these people are still dying. I mean, the people still dying from cancer because of chemical warfare in the South, they're dying.
Welcome to this special program on Kairali channel. This is a panel conversation between Professor Noam Chomsky of University Professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and two leading experts in the field of the mass media in India, Ram, who is editor of Frontline and also editor of Business Line and Sportstar, and Shashi Kumar, the chairman of the Media Development Foundation, which has established in Chennai the Asian College of Journalism. Noam Chomsky is perhaps the world's most renowned academic scholar. He is the founder of the modern science of linguistics. He is a social theorist, activist, a media critic, and author of many books, philosopher, and a great inspiration to people involved in anti-imperialist activism all over the world. Two issues which have appeared in Noam's work. One is to give too much prominence to one incident, and not see the entire context. There's yet another, a methodological point, which he always makes, is that when you assess the deaths caused by an attack, you don't assess the number of people who died in that incident. Because if 5 people die when you destroy a pharmaceutical factory, and that pharmaceutical factory is producing life-saving drugs for millions of people, then those millions must count as part of the victims of that bomb.
It's like starvation, related.
Exactly. So it's, and I think this has, of course, appeared in your recent controversy with Christopher Hitchens, that you don't just measure the number of people who die then, but or look at Iraq. It's not just the people who died in '91, but the many millions who died since then.
And that's all over the world. I mean, take, say, Laos, one of the poorest countries in the world. In the late 1960s, there was what was called a secret bombing of northern Laos. It was secret because the media knew all about it and refused to print it. And I can tell you that from personal experience, from meetings with the editorial board of the New York Times and Time Life and so on. The information was there, they would not print it. I happened to be there shortly after and interviewed refugees and so on. This was bombing in northern Laos, had nothing to do with the Indochina wars. The government admitted that. It's a poor peasant area with, which at that time was became the most heavily bombed area in the world. Now, right now, by now there are millions, literally millions of unexploded, what are called bomblets, you know, the little pieces of cluster bombs that don't explode. There's about a 20-30% failure rate, presumably in order to kill more people. Yeah. Now, if a child picks up one of these little things, flechettes come out and murder him. If a farmer hits one with a hoe, same thing. There are literally millions of them. Now, the number of people dying in northern Laos is not really known, but the aid workers, church volunteer demining groups, I mean, they estimate thousands killed a year. In fact, the Asian Wall Street Journal, their Asia correspondent, Barry Wayne, he accepted the figure of 10,000 deaths a year as possible. You know, he didn't say it's true, he said it could be possible. Well, that's going on right now. You know, this is more than 30 years after the war's over. There's a British demining team, a volunteer demining team trying to deal with it. The Pentagon, to this day, will not give them technical information about how to defuse the unexploded bomblets. Well, these are all casualties of the Vietnam War. You know, the Vietnam War may be over, but these people are still dying. I mean, the people still dying from cancer because of chemical warfare in the South, you know, they're dying. And incidentally, we understand this perfectly when we study an enemy. So if you take, say, the Chinese famine, you know, maybe the greatest crime of communism, in the indictments of communism, the Chinese famine of 1958 to 61. Mao didn't shoot those people. You know, there were just decisions made at a central level which led to a lot of people starving. And those deaths are properly attributed to the central authorities. They didn't take a gun and shoot them. They didn't intend to kill them. It was a decision that led to mass death, and that's a crime. Actually, Jean Drèze and Amartya Sen, in their comparison of India and China, discuss this in some detail, and they correctly describe it as a political crime. It's a crime that has its roots in the ideological and institutional structure of communist China. And that has received an enormous amount of publicity when Amartya Sen won the Nobel Prize. However, they say something else in the same place. They compare it with India. And they say if you compare China and India, which began roughly at the same level in the time of independence, and you look at the policies that were taken, and you compare mortality rates, they say because of China's rural health programs and others, they've lowered the mortality rate. What they say is, this is a virtual quote, that every 8 years, India puts as many skeletons in its closet as China killed during the famine. Yeah. Now, when we that part of their discussion never entered public, the public domain. Yeah. But that's correct. We should apply the same standards to ourselves we apply to others. I mean, take, say, Pol Pot. The CIA did a demographic study after the war was over, and don't know how trustworthy it is, but their estimate, at least, is that the number of people actually killed by Pol Pot was 50 to 100,000. But the number of deaths attributed to him are maybe 1.5 million or something like that. Well, those deaths are not people who were killed. They're people who died as a result of the policies. The Sudan case, which you mentioned, the pharmaceutical factory, the number of people killed in the bombing was a handful, 2 or 3 people. But this is a factory which produced half the pharmaceutical supplies for the country, all the veterinary medicines. Meaning, which for livestock, which mean people's deaths too. Of course. It produced 90% of the essential drugs. What were the consequences? Well, the West doesn't care, so nobody looks. But there have been some people who looked. The German embassy in Sudan did looked at it. Their conclusion is that several tens of thousands of people died. There is one expert, a person, the regional representative of one of the major relief agencies for the Near East, who does field work in Sudan, so he knows the area. His estimate is about the same. Tens of thousands of people died. Well, in the West, this is unknown. And when you mention it, it's considered scandalous to mention it. It's scandalous to mention the fact that we kill people the same way Mao does, or the same way Pol Pot does. So yes, it's fine. The methodological point is kind of dual. We're allowed to understand it when we're talking about an enemy. It's scandalous to apply it to ourselves. Now, if we apply, turning to the present case, the number of deaths in Afghanistan is incalculable. And you're not going to see them. People don't die from starvation in an instant. I mean, they eat grass or roots, and they may drag on for a while. And then their children will die because they're born, too low a birth weight or ill. Yeah. And if you calculate the actual effects of the quite calculated savagery of destroying cities and driving people into the countryside or across the border, it could be millions of people.
Numbers.
Could be millions of people.
Yes.
But to get to this example of a natural disaster, and in India, the point has also been made that the press, the media, acted as an early warning system, and that helped mitigate somewhat the circumstances. I'd like to take your
in the case of the famines.
Famines, yes.
Yeah, hunger as crisis.
But not in the case of the 8 million skeletons put in the closet every 8 years.
Yeah. But I'd like to see this alongside with your views on the media as a celebrated phrase, manufacturing consent. Do you see the media as responsible or accountable for more information or more disinformation? And what's your take on this?
Dam, you have something to add to that? Shashi's.
Yeah, I have a follow-up. I'll wait for the...
Well, at the point you make, first of all, at the role of the Indian media in preventing famines, that's an important one, and it's one that Sen and Dres also make. As part of to the extent that India has a kind of a democratic society, information flows from the ground to the central authorities, and they'll know if there's a famine taking place, and one hopes respond to it. And their point is, in China, this wasn't true.
Yes.
They say the central authorities simply didn't know. It's a totalitarian state. There was no information flowing back. They did not know that their plans were, in fact, causing a major famine. And that's the reason that Sen and Dres and Sen give for the fact that India hasn't had major famine since the end of the colonial period. It's been able to. So that's a positive contribution of the media as part of a democratic society. On the other hand, insofar as the media act as essentially a state propaganda agency, which they do, every time you turn on CNN or BBC, you're seeing that, they are marginalizing information or eliminating it. I mean, they may show a picture of a refugee camp with a child who's dying, but they're not telling you Tony Blair and George W. Bush are purposely murdering huge masses of people. When they talk about the September 11th attacks, they're very clear about it. Yes. This was carried out by evil terrorists who have to be eliminated. And yes, that's legitimate, and a great bitterness and anger and horror, which is correct. You should respond that way. When they refer to the atrocities, the much worse atrocities that their own governments are carrying out, it's a different thing altogether. I mean, it's some event that's happening, unfortunate, in part as part of our pursuit of a just and legitimate war. No passion, no emotion. If anybody's to blame, it's the Taliban or the drought or whatever. In fact, we can be confident that when all of this is over in some horrifying way, and it will be impossible to conceal the fact that lots of people died, it'll be blamed on natural disasters. The drought, the Taliban that wouldn't let relief workers in, or a mistake, maybe we went the wrong place or something, but not on the purposeful, calculated savagery of a project aimed at assassination. Much like Winston Churchill's. Yeah. I mean, the people who died from poison gas and the Air Force, nobody counts them. And in fact, like I say, we'll never find out about them because they've removed the record.
But do you see this as a homogeneous behavior by the media? Isn't there the oppositional media? Isn't there Al Jazeera, for instance, which...
Well, there is Al Jazeera, which is an interesting case. It's the one independent news channel in the whole Arab world. And it is, I mean, I don't watch it all the time, obviously, but it's quite broad. I mean, I've been on it, for example. Colin Powell, Secretary of State's been on it. Ehud Barak, the Prime Minister of Israel.
And Tony Blair demanded equal time.
Tony Blair demanded equal time. Osama bin Laden's on it. And they have discussion programs where people call in. And apparently it's very free and open. Everyone who watches it says it's free and open. It exposes the corruption and violence of the governments. It does all sorts of things. Well, all the governments in the region despise it, naturally, and have been trying to get Qatar, where it's based, to suppress it. Yes. Recently, the U.S. joined in. Colin Powell, urged the Emir of Qatar to, as he put it, rein in Al Jazeera. Yes. That is, don't allow it to be used for purposes other than our propaganda. He didn't put it that way, but that's what it amounts to. The Emir happened to be in Washington and held a press conference in Washington in which he told the press, well, we're under pressure by the State Department to rein in this television station, just as we are from the Arab government. But we're going to defend freedom of press, so we're going to allow the station to continue. And he was saying that in Washington, press conference. It was reported accurately in one newspaper, the Wall Street Journal, had an accurate, honest report. Others had a few sentences and didn't say what it meant. But yes, Al Jazeera is an in fact, Al Jazeera is the only news channel that has had correspondence in Afghanistan. Yes. The destruction of the Buddha statues. I mean, that was their, they reported it. They saw it, filmed it, and reported it, and many other things. And as long as they were talking about crimes of the Taliban, they were just fine. But when they start talking about crimes of the United States, you better rein them in, because we can't allow that. Actually, that's quite normal. During the bombing, one of the major NATO atrocities during the bombing of Serbia was the destruction of the television station. Yes. They bombed the television station and killed a couple of dozen people, and the reason was stated quite clearly. They warned Serbia that this television station would be bombed unless they allowed NATO 6 hours on the television station. I mean, that's like Hitler asking Britain for 6 hours of time on the BBC. Well, the Serbs refused, and then they bombed the station, yes. And that was considered legitimate. Actually, that came up in the war crimes trials, and they considered it, but of course didn't consider it a crime. It was just part of, and they accepted a ludicrous excuse, namely that the television station was sending out signals that were used for military purposes.
A follow-up on manufacturing consent. May I say that media analysis has never been the same since that book appeared, I believe, in 1988, and you have also the Chomsky nuances and analysis, I think, must be somewhat separately looked at, because it's seen as part of a wider system of intellectual consensus building, which is a very, very interesting analysis. Now, Noam, your work with a lot of it in collaboration with Ed Herman is based on, you state right at the outset, on your belief that based on your experience with US media over a long period, it evolved, and you apply it to the performance of the American media. I'm going to, if there's time, I could like to raise two lines of questions. First, the working of the filters, the well-known filters, the 5 filters identifier, and a metaphor is used that as a result of the operation of the filters, all the news that fits to print, that's what is got as a residue after this almost chemical process is over. How current is the operation of these filters? And I have a follow-up on that as well.
Right. What's the second? Well, you can take follow-up.
The second is, how do we apply this can this be applied, your model, the propaganda model, to media performance in other countries, European countries for a start, and then India. What's your thinking as a model builder?
Well,
and also, is it more or less in Europe and Britain? Is there
difference in degree?
Because they interview him all the time, for example.
Yeah.
That's a breach in the
Well,
manufacture of consent.
However, let's take Ram's question.
First of all, this was a joint book, as you said. Ed Herman, who's an economist, very good economist, actually the work on the filters is mostly his work. I mean, I sort of agreed to it, but I see it a little bit differently. In fact, the title of the book illustrates it. The phrase manufacturing consent is not our phrase. We took it from Walter Lippman, the leading public intellectual of the 20th century and the leading figure in the United States and the leading media figure in the 20th century. He used that phrase in a book in the 1920s. On, yes, and which are considered progressive essays on democracy. He was a Wilsonian progressive. And he talked about what he called the art of democracy. And he said the art of democracy requires manufacture of consent. And the reason is that the public has to be excluded from the democratic process. If a democracy is to function, the public has to be excluded. The reason is the public is ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. That's his phrase. They are a bewildered herd, and we have to protect the responsible men, the real decision makers, from the roar and trampling of the bewildered herd. And since we can no longer do this by force, because the country has become more democratic, we have to do it by controlling opinion. So he's not simply talking about the media, he's talking about the intellectual community. The role of the responsible intellectual is to ensure that the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, namely the public, don't become involved in something that's none of their business.
He also thought Asia and Africa are beyond redemption.
They didn't even talk about that. He didn't even have to say it. You know? I mean, he's talking about the democratic societies. It's rather. Britain had the same development took place in England, the two most democratic societies in the world, and it's very striking that should be the case. Actually, these are observations that go back centuries. You know, back to the 17th century. First democratic revolution in England. It was recognized right away. We can't simply control people by violence any longer. We're going to have to control their opinions. David Hume talks about this. But in the First World War, there was a radical change, a big effect on the 20th century in a sense. In the First World War, Britain created what was called a Ministry of Information, which of course means Ministry of Disinformation. And its main purpose was to convince American intellectuals to join the war effort, which Britain badly needed. So they developed all the propaganda you've heard about, you know, Belgian babies with their arms torn off and Hun atrocities and so on. Most of this was produced within the British Ministry of Information, beamed to U.S. intellectuals, who then picked it up and tried to drive the population into jingoist hysteria. In part, it was their own choice, and they're very proud of it. You know, they say this is the first war in history organized by intellectuals, the responsible, serious people, not saying we're repeating British propaganda fabrication. But the Wilson administration didn't take any chances either. It set up a Committee on Public Information, the first U.S. official state propaganda agency, which was designed to convert a pacifist population into anti-German fanatics, and it succeeded. And they were very impressed. A lot of people were impressed. The success of the state propaganda agencies was very impressive. Lippman was part of the Committee on Public Information, and he was using that experience when he was writing that
theorizing
book.
about it.
So intellectuals were, and it became some of the foundations of modern political science. If you read the standard Harold Lasswell, others, they said, yes, we should not. Lasswell was one of the founders of the modern science, so-called. He wrote an article called Propaganda in the Encyclopedia of Social Sciences about that time, in which he said we should not succumb to democratic dogmatisms. about people being the best judges of their own interests. They're not. They're too stupid. We're the best judges of their interests. But since they now have the franchise and they have parliamentary labor parties and so on, we can't just control them by force. So therefore, we have to ensure that they have the right thoughts. And that's our responsibility as serious Democrats. That's the academic side. Others who were impressed, and this is more important really, is the business world. The business world recognized that these are fantastic tools for controlling people. And the huge public relations industry, of which advertising is a component, and it's a monstrous industry, that grew out of this. If you look at its manuals from the 1920s and later, they're very explicit about it. These are incidentally, progressives. Roosevelt, Kennedy, liberals. They're the commissars of the Western societies. And they're very straight. They say we have to regiment the public mind the same way an army regiments their bodies. We have to engineer consent. And that's the essence of democracy. The essence of democracy is for leadership to engineer consent among the bewildered herd, the public, and direct them to something else. We have to impose on them what was called a philosophy of futility, a feeling they can't do anything. We have to direct them to the insignificant things in life, like consumption or some other thing, but just keep them out of our hair. Let us run. We have to be the decision makers, the analysts, and so on. Now, a lot of this is self-serving fraud, because if you ask who the responsible men are, well, it's the people who serve real power. So Walter Lippman was a responsible man because he was working for power, but Eugene Debbs, who's the leading U.S. figure in the labor movement, was in jail, because he said the war wasn't a just war. So you become a responsible man if you serve real power. Then you see yourself as responsible and a proper decision maker. And then insofar as you do serve power, you're allowed freedom to act. If you step outside, you're treated like anyone else who disobeys orders. That's the modern system of thought control.
Welcome to this special program on Kairali channel. This is a panel conversation between Professor Noam Chomsky of University Professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and two leading experts in the field of the mass media in India, Ram, who is editor of Frontline and also editor of Business Line and Sports Star, and Shashi Kumar, the chairman of the Media Development Foundation, which has established in Chennai the Asian College of Journalism. Noam Chomsky is perhaps the world's most renowned academic scholar. He is the founder of the modern science of linguistics. He is a social theorist, activist, a media critic, and author of many books, philosopher, and a great inspiration to people involved in anti-imperialist activism all over the world.
In your framework of analysis, manufacture of consent by the media is part of a continuum.
So what you do, in response to Ram's first question, what you're emphasizing is the continuity.
It's continuous. I mean, it's also true of the academic professions. Take, say, economics. I mean, in economics, there's certain things you measure. There are other things you don't measure. They're called externalities. Well, if you look at the decisions, I mean, they have a strict ideological component. You measure things that are going to be useful for achieving the purposes of power. Externalities you don't count. So, I mean, take, say, the U.S. and Mexico. You measure what's called trade. If you want to estimate the wonders of the so-called free trade agreements, emphasis so-called, because they're not free trade agreements. But if you look at them, you ask, well, how much has trade increased? How much has gross domestic product increased? And a few things you look at. If you look at those things, you get a pretty picture, and then you can have headlines and so on. But what you don't ask is what happened to hundreds of thousands of Mexican farmers who were driven off the land because they couldn't compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness, and that destroyed their communities and their lives and their support systems and drove them into urban slums and finally forced them into the United States where they get killed by border guards. I mean, you just don't count these things. Those are externalities.
May I just take you to second question, the one about different.
Can you apply? How do you
apply to
as a
other
model
countries?
builder? Can you apply?
Well, you know,
To
you
other
have
countries
to
and
look.
other differences of degree?
Each society is itself. You know, so if you apply it to the Soviet Union, it would look a little bit different. In fact, in the Soviet Union, it's not even worth applying it because the center of power was too obvious. So it's not even worth looking.
No, I
at.
think
But in
this is
India,
about Europe. You were asking about Europe and
UK and
take say
European
Europe.
press.
and
Take say
India
Europe.
also.
Yeah, it's kind of a striking fact that almost all. First of all, you can't just I mean, the model is almost a triviality. We don't even call it a theory. In fact, it's common sense, simple common sense. The bulk of the work, in fact, the whole book is concerned with working out the empirical details. What actually happens in crucial cases? And we took a whole
Elections, coverage of
we took
popes,
crucial cases, which would test how it works, and it's astonishing. I mean, it goes beyond what you'd predict, the level of conformity. Now, this detailed, intensive work has been almost entirely done in the United States. There's some in England, virtually none in continental Europe, and so you don't really have the empirical basis for drawing conclusions. Part of the reason it's not done in continental Europe is because the intellectuals there are much more conformist than in the United States. They believe that they're free and independent, and how can anybody ask any questions about us? Look how courageous and tribunes of the people and so on. It's total nonsense. I mean, they're highly conformist and subservient, but so much so that they won't even study themselves.
But would it be correct to say this general impression that the European press has more space for the truth, for facts, for the left?
No, on the contrary. On the contrary. I mean, in fact, when you look at, let's take the French press. Take, say, something that concerns France, like France and Algeria, or for that matter, France in the Second World War. I mean, during the whole post-war period, the truth about France in the Second World War was suppressed. It was finally exposed by scholars in the United States, and then it sort of drifted into France. But they were shocked to discover what anybody who looked from the outside knew was true, that France was a collaborationist country. I mean, they were, including the French intellectuals, almost all of them. There was a resistance, but it was a small resistance. It was, courageous people, but it was by no means a country. Or take, say, France and Algeria. I mean, the atrocities that the French carried out in Algeria are only now beginning to be exposed because of, generals in the army who say, yeah, I did this horrible thing. It gets worse. When France left Algeria, it left it the way Britain left Nigeria and so on. The idea was to maintain the colonial structure, but in a different framework. That's the way all the European countries decolonized. Let's try to maintain the structure, but with a different form. All right, in North Africa and Algeria, there was an independence movement. It gradually dissolved for various reasons. It ended up with a system in which French intelligence is closely integrated with the Algerian government, and they are carrying out murderous terror right now. This is not it's beginning to be exposed in France. I mean, Algerians have been exposing it for a long time. It's just, let me give you one example, which I was involved in, so I know about it. There are many, there's a lot of what's called Islamic terror in Algeria, and some of it actually is radical Islamic terror, but it's pretty clear that a lot of it, probably most of it's being carried out by the government under the guise of Islamic terror. Well, a few years ago, a group of Algerian expatriate scientists, physicists and others, tried to put together a careful study of the atrocities in Algeria. I knew about this because one of them happens to be a colleague of mine in the physics department at MIT, so I learned about it from him and followed it. And they asked me to write the introduction to their book, so I wrote it. So there's a big book, which is a detailed, careful study done by quite competent scientists and historians, in which they simply study the massacres, case by case, and ask what happened. And a typical story is something like this. there's a slum area, always very poor areas, exactly the areas you'd expect the Islamic militants not to hit. It's their base of support. So there's a slum area somewhere. People come in dressed in Islamic garb and so on, and they start murdering everybody. And it goes on for 10 hours. 5 kilometers away, there's a big military base, and nobody notices. Nobody comes over and does anything. And when the massacre's over and the people are dead, there's a big propaganda about Islamic massacre. 6 months later, some general buys the land and builds a hotel. I mean, that's a typical massacre. And they give case after case like this big, thick book. I wrote the introduction. It was impossible to get it published in France. Oh, in the background is the fact, which I talked about in my introduction, that probably the Algerian state and French intelligence are manipulating this, and there's reasonable evidence for it. They couldn't get it published in France, so it got published in Switzerland. You couldn't get a copy into France. Finally, one copy of the book got into France through my efforts. I asked an American expatriate living in France to get the American Library in Paris to buy one copy. So, okay, one copy of the book got into France. They tried to have a press conference to open the book. It was suppressed. France does not, and they do not want to know about their ongoing atrocities. Now, it's not, I don't want to make it 100%, so like Le Monde Diplomatique is quite different. There are exceptions. But overwhelmingly, this is the way it works. And it's the same in every country. Everyone I've ever looked at. I mean, in Britain, there is a good media analysis group in Glasgow University, and they've exposed things done by the British press, which are astonishing.
No, we have about 10 minutes left. Can I ask a follow-up question on this? Just manufacturing consent, isn't it also the case that what has really happened since the Second World War, from Truman to Clinton and Bush, is the ascendancy of the American information system? And the US has consciously spent money and effort on that, something like $3 trillion to ensure the information ascendancy. So that the rest of the world is really caught into a mold of tailism, much of it. Even in cinema, for instance, Hollywoodization, you don't have French cinema.
Ben Bagdikane has an essay on
any other
cinema.
In fact, well, I'm sure you remember, but back in the 1970s, the Third World tried to institute through the United Nations a new international information order.
McBride Commission reports.
Yeah, McBride Commission and others, they tried to work it through UNESCO. What they were calling for was an opening up of the international media, so there could be some level of participation from the South.
Yes.
Well, that led to total hysteria in the United States. There was a huge attack on it. There was a pretense that they were trying to stop freedom of the press, which was a total lie. Lie after lie was produced. It could never be refuted. The UNESCO people, McBride himself, they were not allowed to even publish a letter in the New York Times responding to it. Right. Finally, the United States virtually destroyed UNESCO in order to prevent a slight opening of the information system, which would have meant marginal participation by the South. If you look at resources, you can imagine how it would have come if it was opened up. But the idea that there might be some breakdown in the totalitarian control did lead to hysteria. There's a very good book about this called Hope and Folly. Ed Herman was one of the people. That book was published by a university press, major press. It has never been mentioned. It's never been reviewed. It's never been mentioned, exposing the whole thing. Yeah. And that reflects their understanding that you must maintain tight control over information. This morning's newspaper discusses how the U.S. and Britain are coordinating their propaganda efforts to enable them to compete with Taliban propaganda. I mean, if you think about this, you don't even know how to respond. But that expresses the quite proper fear of those who run the world, that if anything gets out of control, even the smallest thing, the whole system could unravel. So it may be Taliban propaganda we can't compete with.
Noam, you wrote a famous essay. I recently downloaded it on the net. Appeared in the New York Review of Books in, I believe, February 1967, The Responsibility of Intellectuals. And that was in the background of not only your opposition to the Vietnam War, but you were among the first American intellectuals. It's considered a watershed to oppose the war. And I remember one of the formulations, it's the responsibility of intellectuals to expose the lies of governments, etc. What is the responsibility of intellectuals, both American and intellectuals and intellectuals abroad, including Indian intellectuals, vis-a-vis the present international crisis about policy outcomes? What is their responsibility?
Well, it's pretty elementary. Tell the truth. You know? Don't subordinate yourself to the power systems. Tell the truth, and tell it to the people who have to know. Like, you know, there are friends of mine in the Quaker movement and others who have the slogan, "Tell truth to power." I've never agreed with them. You don't have to tell truth to power. They know all about it already. What you do is tell truth to the powerless. And don't tell truth to them, but listen to them. You know, be part of the powerless. Interact with the powerless. You use your capacity, your luck. If we're to be an intellectual is to be lucky. It's to be privileged. To be much too wealthy, more wealthy than we ought to be. To have training and you know, access to resources. I mean, you can do things. You can do things that ordinary poor people can't do. So you should join them, participate with them, contribute what you have as a result of your own privilege, which you shouldn't have, but you do have, and be part of them. You don't tell them truth, you learn truth from them, you contribute what you can, and you, in this case, I mean, we should be working day and night to stop one of the major atrocities of modern times. You know, a planned mass murder of several million people, that's not a small thing. And we should try to break the monopoly of control by the British and American and Western and, in fact, the organized, not just media, but the propaganda system in general, and get people to understand it. That's what happened during the Vietnam War. There were very few intellectuals who opposed the Vietnam War, ever.
You went to jail.
Yeah, but you know, there were few people, not much. In fact, the difference between the intellectuals and the population is quite dramatic. There's good studies of it. I mean, a tiny percentage of elite intellectuals opposed, I mean, at some point, everyone opposed the war, like the business community opposed it. It was just costing too much. But if you look at the principled opposition, you know, opposition because it's wrong, among intellectuals, it's virtually non-existent. You cannot find a phrase, virtually, in the major journals or opinion or media or whatever, saying the war was wrong. The most you can find at the sort of left end is, well, Anthony Lewis of the New York Times. It began with blundering efforts to do good, but by 1969 it was clear that it was costing us too much, so it was a mistake. That's the critical position. You take a look at the population. The United States is a very heavily, there are a lot of opinion studies, very intense. The Chicago Council of Foreign Relations does regular studies of people's attitudes on all sorts of topics. Since 1969, they have regularly published studies on this. And a lot of the questions are about the Vietnam War, of course. One of the questions is, what do you think about the Vietnam War? And people have a series of choices. It's an open question. You don't get high numbers on an open question usually, but on this you do. About 70% of the population from 1969 up until today says the Vietnam War was fundamentally wrong and immoral, not a mistake. Okay, that's 70% of the population, virtually none of the intellectuals. And those are remarkable numbers because they never hear it. Every person who answers that way made it up for themselves because they never read it and they never heard it. Intellectual opinion is, well, you know, it's a benign effort that went wrong and it was a mistake, but not the population.
There's no time for questions on linguistics.
I'm afraid not. Just on this point, there's like the Economist's cover which says,
heart-rending but necessary war.
Necessary. Just like Osama bin Laden. It's a legitimate terror. It's legitimate terror, you know, unfortunate, but it's legitimate. That's the Economist. The Economist and bin Laden are identical, except for which terror you like. And the Economist is much more far-ranging, remember. They're going to drive the people they don't like out of the world. Yes. Bin Laden wants to drive them out of the Muslim world. Much more modest objective.
On the intellectuals, there's just one quick follow-on question, if I may. The problem of who the intellectual is, because television also manufactures quick fix intellectuals now, and people like Derrida are warning us against intellectuals against the temptation of the media. Do you think there's a case for that?
I don't even use the word intellectuals. Right. I mean, intellectuals are, I mean, I've known people who I would call intellectuals who never went to school, you know, who, you know, were just became self-educated and know much more than professors I know at Harvard, you know. It's a, you know, it's a term that privileged people use to refer to themselves, and we should drop it. You know, it's people who want to find out and understand the world.
With that, we must end. And I'm sure Ram, Shashi, both of you join me in thanking Noam for this wonderful conversation.
It's been a privilege talking to you.
Good talking to you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
We did.
Hello.
Hello, is Dr. Chomsky online?
Yes, he is.
My name is Ram Kumar. I'm calling from Trivandrum. I have two questions for Dr. Chomsky. The first part is, could you kindly comment on how widespread is the support within the United States for the U.S. retaliation in Afghanistan? How does the U.S. citizens react to it? The second part of the question is, what do you think are the new challenges before the next movement in the United States after the events of September 11? How have the challenges and the world changed? For
Thank you, Ram Kumar. Thank you. We have the question. We have the question. Thank you.
First, I would strongly suggest that you not pay too much attention to what you read in the newspapers and hear on television. Actual support, actual attitudes in the United States are much more mixed and complex than what you might expect from what you hear. People are, of course, outraged, frightened, angry, fearful. They correctly regard it as an atrocity and think that something should be done about it. If they're asked in, say, polls, should we strike at the terrorists and destroy them, most people say yes. So it looks as if there's a lot of support. On the other hand, when people are asked, should we carry out a retaliation in which innocent civilians will be harmed, the numbers go way down. If, unfortunately this is not asked because people are not supposed to think about it, but if people were asked, do you think we should be driving large numbers of people into starvation and death, virtually no one would support it. That's one of the reasons why these issues are deflected in the media, are not discussed. As for the challenges to the left, well, one challenge is the usual one. Break through the pattern of propaganda control, help people understand what is actually happening. If they understand what is actually happening, I have no doubt that there'll be massive popular opposition. Beyond that, the challenges are not new, they're old. Remember, every time there's a crisis, it can be an earthquake or a war or anything else, the battle that is constantly going on, a kind of class war that's constantly going on, one participant continues without a stop. In fact, uses the opportunity relentlessly to pursue their agenda. And that's true now too. The privileged and powerful sectors are using the sense of crisis in order to implement projects that they know they could never carry out because of public opposition. A whole range of them, from cutting corporate taxes to granting the president the authority to make executive agreements, to increasing the missile defense system and so on. These are all being pushed through rapidly, while the general population is told, you have to be patriotic and quiet and acquiescent and call off your protests and you have to disappear from the conflict. We'll continue even more strongly than before. Well, the task of the left is to resist that and to continue to face exactly the old challenges. I don't even call it the left. I mean, so for example, on the international economics agreements, what's going on in Doha, the so-called trade agreements, the overwhelming majority of the population is opposed to them. And the task of the left is just to clarify and organize and sharpen and turn that protest into something constructive and meaningful. That was a task before, it's a task now. Same on issues of militarization. The public doesn't want to have huge amounts of money spent on military systems, which will in fact be harmful to the United States as well as to everyone else. Task of the left is to, same thing, to be a spark to help organize and turn those natural and proper concerns into something useful and constructive. Beyond that, it's to organize people to dismantle the system of control and oppression, both in the economic system and the social system and elsewhere.
Hello?
Hello.
Hello, yes. Who's speaking?
Sir, I'm Rekha calling from Ernakulam.
Yes? Yes, Rekha. What is your question? Yes.
Could you kindly say something about the problems of poverty and deprivation in different parts of the world today? And also, what are the main forms of deprivation in the United States? Am I clear, sir?
Yes, you are. Thank you.
Living in India, you can tell me much more about the problems of poverty and deprivation than I can tell you. Take say food. There are ample supplies of food in the world, but they are not going to the people who need them. In India, for example, there are huge supplies of food rotting in storehouses and maybe being eaten by rats, but not going to the people who need them. And that's true worldwide. It's not a food problem, it's a social problem. It's a problem of society and its organization. And the same is true of other forms of deprivation. There are billions of people in the world who do not have clean water. That's the worst, probably the worst health problem that exists. It's easily within the capacity of contemporary available resources to overcome that. For what amount to trivial sums, these major problems could be overcome. There are probably, during the time that we are talking, there are several thousand children around the world dying from easily treatable diseases, like diarrhea. That takes a little hydration. Many of them in India, in fact, a large percentage of them in India. Well, there's certainly available resources to overcome that. The fact that we don't overcome it is a choice. It's a crime, a major crime on the part of the privileged sectors of the world, including India, the privileged sectors here and in the West and elsewhere. The problems can be overcome. The term silent genocide actually was used by the director of the United Nations World Food Program just a few days ago on World Food Day, when he described the problem of starvation throughout the world as what he called silent genocide. It's a good term. It's a genocide that can be stopped, and it extends in all sorts of ways. In the United States, this very rich country, the problems are there, but they're by no means as severe as they are in South Asia. But they're there. I mean, there are people living not far from where I live, right in the center of the world's educational center, the peak educational center, Harvard University, Harvard Square, where it is located. You can walk around the area. There are homeless people sleeping in the streets. Sleeping in the streets in Boston is not so simple. That means sleeping in temperatures that are well below freezing overnight, with snow, in rags, with no food. Some of the people used to sleep on grates that are used for heating pipes from which heat comes out. The university removed them because it's unsightly to have people sleeping there. They should sleep where it's freezing. The United States has, among countries where there are meaningful statistics, it has the highest percentage of the population in jail in the world. That's a neoliberal achievement. That wasn't true in 1980. That's a consequence of the last 20 years of programs which have rapidly increased the number of people in jail. Those are mostly poor black and poor Hispanic people. Tossed into jail because they're superfluous in this form of society, the neoliberal societies. You can find the kinds of deprivation and poverty that you find massively in South Asia, which is probably the worst part of the world in this respect. you also find in the rich countries, but less dramatically because they're richer. And they're criminal no matter where they are.
Hello.
Hello?
Hello, yes.
Question ചോദിക്കാനായിരുന്നു.
ചോദിച്ചോളൂ. എന്താ പേരെന്താണ്?
ഗീത.
എവിടുന്നാ?
ട്രിവാൻഡ്രത്ത് തന്നെ.
ചോദിച്ചോളൂ.
ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലാണ് ചോദിക്കുന്നത്.
ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ ചോദിച്ചോളൂ.
I want to know your attitude about the expression of freedom. As an American citizen, you have been traveling and expressing your views regarding imperialistic and colonialistic attitude of the US government as a state. My question is that, as an American citizen, you have the right to express yourself without much obstruction. But as far as India is concerned, the indigenous people suffers many types of objection regarding the freedom of expression. The left platform now you are in has been intolerant towards the free expression. History tells us that they had seized many publications which were against them. Freedom of expression given by the world police and curtailing the freedom of expression in front of me seems to be contradictory. Everything seems to be contradictory. I think it's better America who would safeguard its citizens' right to live and also to express. I want to know about your opinion about this.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. The United States has achieved over the centuries a high degree of protection for freedom of expression. In fact, it's unique in the world in this respect. It was not given as a gift. I mentioned earlier in the program that the leading figure in U.S. labor, Eugene Debbs, was in prison because he was critical of the First World War. Well, that's not freedom of expression. In fact, during any period of crisis, not serious crisis, freedom of expression has been sharply restricted. On the other hand, by comparative standards, it's quite high. However, freedom of expression, it's a right. But remember, this is a kind of a capitalist, semi-capitalist society, meaning that everything becomes a commodity. One of the things that's a commodity is freedom. A lot of it is available in principle, and you have as much of it as you can buy. And so if you're relatively privileged, you have a lot. In fact, one of the reasons freedom of expression is protected because the rich and powerful are the primary beneficiaries of it. On the other hand, if you're a poor black child in the ghetto, and you may technically have freedom of expression, but if the police pick you up and throw you in jail, there's nothing you can do about it, though you had freedom of expression. Indigenous people, it's the same. They technically have the right to speak, but the opportunities are not there, and harsh repression can come without anybody noticing it if they go too far. I mean, there's a lot of, everyone's heard of Watergate, terrible crime. Watergate is considered a terrible crime. It was a very minor event, actually, because the people who were under attack in Watergate were rich, powerful people, and they had minor difficulties, and that's considered an outrage. At the same time as Watergate, a black organizer, one of the leading black organizers, Fred Hampton, was murdered by the police and the FBI in a raid that could have been run by the Gestapo. 4 o'clock in the morning, the police broke in with FBI assistance and murdered him in bed. Well, that's not considered a crime. You didn't hear about that one, I'm sure. And that was at the same time as Watergate. So yes, there's freedom of expression, and it's an important thing. I don't think it's insignificant. It took centuries to achieve it. I mean, it wasn't until about 30 years ago, in the context of the civil rights movement, that the courts actually recognized freedom of expression as a right for the first time. That's recent. And it was the result of a lot of struggle, and it's a wonderful achievement. On the other hand, we should recognize, as I think you're saying, that it's a formal right which is beneficial to those who are in a position to use it, and is available much less to those who live under conditions of oppression and domination. And I'm sure same is true in India, but in a more extreme form.
Hello.
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 Hello, yes. Hello, who's speaking?
Chomsky?
Yes.
Hello.
Who is speaking?
Online.
Yes. Who is speaking?
This is Vikas Raval from Trivandrum.
Yes.
Can I give my question?
Yes, you may, please.
Professor Chomsky, you've written on energy. What, in your opinion, does energy hold for the future of this world?
You're quite right that the events of September 11th illustrated the irrelevance of national missile defense to any defensive purpose. But that, in fact, had been known before. It was well understood that they're much more, if anyone wants to set off, say, a nuclear explosion in the United States, they're not going to send it by a missile, and unless they have an urge for massive self-destruction. I mean, if you want to, say, set off a nuclear explosion in the United States, what you would do is take a 15-pound plutonium bomb, put it in a suitcase, sneak it across the Canadian border somewhere, and blow up New York City. That can't be stopped. No one will send a missile. The National Missile Defense Program has essentially nothing to do with defense. When the word defense is used, you should hear offense. So every country has a defense department which is designed for offensive purposes. And the same is true of national missile defense. It's an offensive weapon. And it's in fact part of a much broader system of militarization of space, which the United States has been pursuing. And you're right, India was the first country to enthusiastically indicate support for it, although the foreign minister backed off and said he had been misinterpreted, so I don't know exactly what India's position is. But this program, there is an outer space treaty signed in 1967, which has been enforced. Nobody's violated it. It's clear to the world now. It eliminates, it bans any military weapons in space. It's clear to the world that the United States intends to violate that treaty. Therefore, it has come up at the United Nations for the last few years for a vote. And it's been a unanimous vote in favor of it, except for the United States and Israel, which have abstained. They don't want to vote against it, but they haven't reaffirmed it because the U.S. intends to violate it and Israel goes along. Maybe India will go along next time. There are programs in place to try to place offensive weapons in space. That's part of what's called the National Missile Defense Program. Maybe I should make a technical point. If anybody believed in national missile defense seriously, they would understand the dilemma that arises. Missile defense program relies on satellites. It relies crucially on satellite communication in order to control it. It's very easy to shoot down satellites. That's a lot easier than shooting down missiles. You know where they are, they don't move around, and so on. So anti-satellite weapons are the poor man's weapon. Any country with some technical capacity can develop them. Therefore, if the United States wants to have a missile defense system, it's going to have to prevent anti-satellite weapons from working, which means it has to have such overwhelming dominance of space and the world that no country can even use the poor man's weapon. That's even if you believe in the missile defense. Over and above that, their goal, and they say it very clearly, it's not a secret, it's public, is to develop space weapons which function exactly the way navies functioned in the past. So in past years, say, the British Navy was developed to protect British commercial interests, investment, access to resources, control over other countries, and so on. That was the purpose of the British Navy. There's a lot of the background reason for the conquest of India was for Britain to get a opium monopoly, which it used, in fact, the revenue from it was used to support the British Navy, to control the empire. Now, the U.S. intends to carry that forward. The day of navies is over. We're now in the days of space. So we want space forces to protect U.S. interests, investment, resource access, and so on worldwide. That is explicit policy. I'm just quoting from high-level planning documents. And they expect this to be even more necessary in the future than it is now because of the effects of what they call globalization. It is assumed that the form of globalization that they're instituting through the World Trade Organization and others is going to lead to a widening divide, more poor people and a small number of rich people. So that's predicted. And if there's a growing mass of impoverished people around the world, they're likely to become unruly and disruptive and do things that the powerful don't want. So therefore we need powerful forces, space-based military forces, which will control them just the way armies and navies and the Air Force controlled them in the past. This is the next frontier for controlling the world. It's completely open and overt. If everyone doesn't know about it, it's because the media and the intellectuals choose not to let the population know. There's no secret about these documents. They are publicly available. The highest level documents and the programs are being implemented. It's called defense, but everything's called defense. That's the National Missile Defense Program. So it's perfectly true, to get back to your point, that the September 11th attacks wouldn't have been stopped by this, but nobody cares, because that's not what it's for. It's for a different purpose. That's why it's immediately escalated in the window of opportunity given by the fear and concern of the public when resistance subsides.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes.
Am I speaking to respected Noam Chomsky?
Yes. What is your name? Where are you speaking
I
from?
am Suresh Babu from Kottayam.
Suresh Babu from Kottayam. Yes. Go ahead and ask your question, Mr. Suresh Babu.
Sir, so such a terrorist who is protected by a country which is ruled by religious fanatics and which is almost full of illiterate and very religious people who are also supporting him. So my question is whether he should be killed for his terrorist activities all over the world. If yes, how is it possible without doing any harm to the innocent people in Afghanistan?
Well,
Yes.
First of all, Osama bin Laden, in fact, did not admit anything. At least what was reported was that he described the actions on September 11th as legitimate, and he said that when we carry out terror to defend ourselves, the Muslim lands and people, that's legitimate terror, but when others attack us, that's illegitimate terror. That's not taking responsibility for anything. It's possible that he's involved, it's possible that he's not involved, and we know nothing more about that than we knew yesterday. The position that should he be killed, should someone who says that terror is legitimate be killed? Well, if you really believe that, there are a lot of people who are going to have to be killed. I mean, you have to start with George W. Bush, and then go to Tony Blair, and then go to your own government. They're all going to have to be killed because they all say exactly what Osama bin Laden says, namely, terror is legitimate if we carry it out. So the people who are saying that right now that the attack on Afghanistan is just and legitimate and maybe regrettable but necessary, they're all saying that massive terror is good, is fine, as long as we're carrying it out. So if the principle is that someone who claims that terror is legitimate has to be killed, we can start right here. We don't have to worry about Osama bin Laden. And furthermore, they're talking about much worse terror. The atrocities on September 11th were bad enough, but what the world leaders, with India's support, are doing to the people of Afghanistan is far worse in terms of numbers and scale and disaster and so on. Furthermore, the people who are leading this crusade happen to be the world's leading terrorists. Remember, the United States is the only country in the world, that has been condemned by the World Court for international terrorism, ordered to desist, and then dismissed the order and went on. It's the only country in the world that, it vetoed a Security Council resolution calling on it to observe international law. When Donald Rumsfeld comes to India and talks about crushing terror, remember, he was part of a government. He was an official in a government, the Reagan administration, which was condemned for international terrorism by the World Court and then continued it and escalated it. It's war against Nicaragua. So the war against terrorism is being led by some of the leading, maybe the leading terrorists in the world, and they regard terror as legitimate, including the terror they're now carrying out. Well, let's take the specific case of Osama bin Laden. If he is responsible for terrorist acts, there's a way to deal with that. The way to deal with it is there are legal measures to deal with a criminal. So suppose somebody, let's take a small problem. Suppose somebody robs my home, and I think I think I know who it is. I think it's someone on the other side of the city who probably did it. Am I supposed to take an assault rifle and go murder everybody in his neighborhood? I mean, is that the right way to respond to the fact that I think he's responsible? No. The right way to respond is to use the system of justice that's available, find evidence. If you can get legitimate evidence, try to get the person who's involved, bring him to justice, and look into the background grievances that led to the robbery in the first place. They're always there. That would be the right approach in this case too. Why is the United States not following that approach? Well, several reasons. For one thing, they don't have the evidence. For another thing, they do not want authorization. The United States is not going to the Security Council and saying, give us authorization to carry out a military attack. They could get that authorization from the Security Council, but they don't want it. They don't want it because they want to retain the authority to act unilaterally without authorization. And that's what it means to be a terrorist state. You do not want authorization. You know, if you're the head of a criminal gang, you don't want authorization from the police to do what you do. You want to do it on your own because you don't need authorization. So yes, the criminal states want to act violently on their own and therefore are not pursuing the legitimate means that are available. And they are available. Other countries have used them. So take, say, Nicaragua, small country. It was under attack by the United States for 10 years. That attack was very serious. Killed tens of thousands of people, practically destroyed the country, may never recover. They did not respond by setting off bombs in Washington, which they could have done. They responded by going to the World Court with a case saying the United States is attacking us, carrying out an international terrorist attack against us, we want you to order them to stop. The World Court, which is the highest judicial body in the world, listened to their case, accepted it, rejected the U.S. response, ordered the United States to terminate the international terrorist attack. Well, of course, the U.S. dismissed that and escalated the attack. Nicaragua went to the Security Council, which tried to pass a resolution, but the U.S. vetoed it. Well, okay, at that point, Nicaragua couldn't do anything. It's a small, weak country. If the United States pursued the legal course, nobody would stop it. In fact, everyone would applaud. But as I say, it doesn't want to do it because it does not want to have the authorization. Like any criminal, it wants to have everyone understand that I'm going to act without authorization. You better be afraid of me. If there were a concern to, say, extradite Osama bin Laden, it could probably be done. We don't know for certain. But the Taliban did offer to negotiate. They offered to negotiate the question of extradition of bin Laden. In fact, what they said is, present us with some evidence and we will consider extradition. It's exactly what any other country would do. I mean, if someone came to India, let's say, and said, you have someone in India who I think is a criminal, so send him over to me and I'll take care of him. Would India do it? Of course not. No, they'd say, okay, present us with your evidence and we'll consider it, and if it looks legitimate, yeah, we'll extradite him. But the U.S. Doesn't want to pursue that course. When the Taliban offered to negotiate and asked for evidence, George Bush stood up on television and said, you know, we're not going to pay any attention to you, we'll bomb you. We don't want to give you evidence, none of your business. We say, give them to us, so give them to us. Well, you know, that is a way of demonstrating that they do not want him extradited. They do not want to solve the issue by peaceful means. Would it have worked? Were the Taliban serious? Well, you know, we really don't know. There's only one way to find out, and that's to pursue the offers, which the U.S. didn't want to do. So yes, there might well be a way to deal with Osama bin Laden by legal, proper procedures, but the West doesn't want to follow it. For one reason, because they don't have the evidence, and for another, because they want everyone to understand that they have the authority granted by themselves to act violently without any authorization.
Hello.
Hello, could I speak to Mr. Chomsky?
Yes, what is
your name? Where are you calling from?
I am Murali calling from Palkad, sir.
Good. Murali, what is your question? Go ahead.
Yeah, my question is, what do you think is the truth about the anthrax scare in United States? Is it a problem that has been blown out of proportion by the media and the US establishment?
Excellent. Thank you.
Well, the anthrax problem is quite real. Someone is sending anthrax, which is a deadly poison, to people in the United States. It's the FBI, the criminal investigation system, has been spending all of its resources trying to trace this. They cannot find out who did it. They have no idea who did it. Somebody's doing it, probably somebody inside the United States. They don't know why, they don't know who, they don't know where it's coming from. And people are frightened, which is perfectly legitimate. The number of people killed happens to be small, it's a handful, but people are afraid. That tells you something. Imagine if they cannot find inside the United States, with all of the police resources available, the source of a letter that is mailed from, they know the post office from which it was mailed and so on and so forth. Imagine the difficulty of finding out who was responsible for the September 11th bombing. It's true that they can't find out who, but that's an immensely more difficult problem, and they can't do it. Even the anthrax threat has not been identified, with all of the country's resources being devoted to it, and it's internal to the United States. So yes, the fear is very real. And understandable, and they do not know the answer.
Is it blown out of proportion?
Is it blown out of proportion? Well, I don't know. People are afraid, and rightly afraid. It's true that a handful of people have been killed, but you never know whether the next piece of mail you're picking up is going to have anthrax spores in it. And that is enough to frighten people. Of course, in most of the world, they're facing threats far beyond that. But this is a threat, a real threat, that rich and privileged people are facing who aren't used to threats. They're used to threats being somewhere else.
I think one thing implied in the question by Murali was, what is this linked to? Is the anthrax scare linked to September 11th, and what are the connections?
Nobody has any idea. The FBI doesn't know. The CIA doesn't know. Nobody knows. So your guess is as good as anyone else's. The current assumption is it's probably something in the United States, maybe a reaction to September 11th, but it could be some crazy person somewhere who decided to react to September 11th by frightening people. That kind of thing happens, unfortunately.
Thank you. Before we end, we have to end this program now, and I would like to thank our two panelists, Ram and Shashi Kumar, for their participation in it. And I'm sure that Ram and Shashi join me in thanking Professor Chomsky for this very special opportunity and conversation. Thank you, Noam.